Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com, the ChrisVossShow.com. Hey, we're coming here with another awesome podcast. I am super excited to get this guest. I've been wanting to interview this gentleman for quite some time because of some of the things that we're seeing in our world, in our America right now, and things that are impacting us almost on a daily basis, especially if your kids cowering in a school from shooters, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got a wonderful gentleman on the show today. Be sure to tell your friends, neighbors, relatives to go to iTunes, Google Play. Please refer the show to your friends. Tell them to sign up there and subscribe. Go to youtube.com/Chris Voss and hit that bell notification because we've got the brand new Siberian puppy. You can see we've also got all the great reviews. We're reviewing something really cool from Drobo that we just did today, like a $700 NAS system. So that's going to be really cool. So check that out. And also take and see the podcast that we have there. So the gentleman I have today is a PhD. He is Dr. Warren Farrell, and he is the author of the just published The Boy Crisis with co-author John Gray. It exposes the boy crisis worldwide, as well as the causes and solutions that can be implemented by parents, schools, and policymakers. Dr. Farrell has been chosen by the Financial Times as one of the world's top 100 thought leaders. His books are published in over 50 countries and 19 languages. He has a ton of books, by the way. They should include 2 award-winning international bestsellers, Why Men Are the Way They Are, plus the myth of male power, I should say. Sorry for butchering that. Welcome to the show, Dr. Warren. We certainly appreciate you being here.
I've just totally enjoyed my show talk with you. I'm looking forward to this too.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I've been really excited to check out this book because a lot of my discussions seem to be online. You know, we're trying to resolve some of these issues as to why boys are shooting, why it's only boys shooting up schools and all this sort of good stuff. What was it that prompted you to write this book? Let's start with the foundation there.
Yes, I've been writing books on adult men and women all my life, and Why Men Are the Way They Are, Myth of Male Power, those types of books. But then as I started having some of those books translated in other countries like Japan and Australia and just Europe, etc., I started hearing from different people. After the talk time afterwards, my boys are having problems. My boys are having problems. My sons are this, and how do I get my son not to be so depressed and ADHD and so on? And so I started looking at some of the data and then looked at the United Nations stuff and found that in the largest 60 plus developed nations, boys were falling behind girls on not just the reading and the writing like they always have fallen behind girls, but now math and science. And it was in every academic area. And so that piqued my curiosity. And so I started to look a little further and found that they weren't just falling behind in school in academic subjects, but as any parent will know, when they're falling behind in school, that's usually a symptom of a deeper set of problems. And that deeper set of problems was they weren't having good emotional intelligence, they weren't having good social skills, they weren't having their physical health was declining, they were having lower sperm counts, lower telomeres, shorter telomeres were manifesting. They were having the IQs were dropping, just things that were amazing to me. You think things like IQ, I thought were fairly hardwired, and they weren't going to be likely to be dropping over a period of generations, especially in relation to girls. The boys were committing significant amounts of suicide, and they were, of course, doing the school shootings. And so I'm wondering, what is it that developed nations have in common? And what I saw was that they have enough mastery of survival to be able to be able to allow permission in the society for 2 things. One was more permission for divorce, and the other one was more permission to have women be able to be married. To have children without being married. So I looked at the data in the United States and saw that in the United States, 53% of women who were under 30 when they had children had their children without being married. And, I'm not a big thing on, marriage versus non-marriage, but I saw that when you have children without being married, that the father is very minimally likely to be with the children for more than 2 years, 2 to 3 years. And so, and it was when the father was not significantly involved with children that both boys and girls were having major problems, and especially boys. And then among children of divorce, those that had the minimal amount of father involvement after divorce, those boys and girls were having significant problems, but again, especially the boys. And in both of those groups, that was where the bulk of boys that were involved with the boy crisis were occurring in much higher percentages. The good news was I found that among boys who had a significant amount of father involvement, they were doing very well. And when I looked more closely at that, I saw that the fathers were far more involved with boys among that group of boys than my father had been, or my father's father had been for him. And so we have this enormous gap between what I call dad enriched boys, that is, boys that have the enrichment of their fathers, and dad deprived boys, or boys that have minimal father involvement or no father involvement at all.
Yeah, I mean, you are probably just slightly older than myself. I was born in 1968 and I grew up in the 70s. And I remember on our street, everyone was married on the street, and there was one gal who, she wasn't actually divorced. She was widowed because her husband, I think at 42, was a really nice guy, had a heart attack, her next door neighbor, and he passed away from the heart attack. And after that, she was, dating men and seemed to be single for quite some time. I think there was a time where she grieved, but all the married women on the street would whisper about her, oh, she's the divorced one. She's this, oh, what's, and there was kind of that going on. And I've always kind of thought about that as our society's changed. And now we flip the switch where the divorced chicks all on the street are probably talking about the one married girl. No, she's the married one.
Yes, exactly right.
And the norms of our society completely flipped. You see that in the advertising that we have. A lot of people don't pay attention to our advertising, but our advertising is very single person, single parent driven. It's either targeted towards single dads or single moms. And you never see, like, I even saw an ad one time the other day that showed like the divorced dad dropping off the kids at mom's house. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, that's an interesting place to have an ad, but I mean, the advertising community has accepted that this is our new norm as a way of life. And I've been interested as to how that switch flipped in our society, the impact it had towards growing up without a dad. I'm a big believer that mothers are nurturers and they're caretakers, and dads will kick your ass and keep you in line. Moms will kick your ass and keep you in line, but my mom was certainly more lackadaisical at letting things slide a little bit because she was, the mom, and dad was the one that, he was the one who's the enforcer, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Penalties. Wait till your dad comes home, which,
Exactly. Well, first of all, let's go back to your original comment about our being the same age. Thank you very much. But I'm an entire generation older than you are. I'm just turning 75 next month. But that was very sweet of you.
I feel 75.
You feel 75. So anyway, and yes, in my generation, I only had one boy in my class who was the product of a divorce home, and he would swear at his mother, and my parents encouraged me to drop him as a friend because he had such an enormous amount of disrespect. But I had no idea it was that he had, I didn't connect, when I was in 7th grade, the fact that he was the only boy in the class who was in a mother-only home, and all the rest of us were fortunate enough to have mother and fathers in our homes. And I had no idea what the connection was between that and the way he talked to his mom. Now I understand a great deal about that, meaning that, and the single word that you used as you were describing this, the word enforce, there lies that if there was one word that describes the difference between moms and dads, it is not moms and dads setting boundaries. It is moms and dads enforcing boundaries. So, for example, moms and dads will both set pretty much the same boundaries. They'll say, you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. And the children will do the same thing with both moms and dads. They'll test the boundaries. They'll try to have as few peas as possible before they get their ice cream. And the difference is the way moms and dads enforce the boundaries. So the moms will say, the kids will say to the moms, can I have after a few peas, can I have my ice cream now? And moms will say, sweetie, I said that you couldn't have your ice cream until you finish your peas, but I'll tell you what, if you have a few more peas, then you can have your ice cream, because I know it's been a hard day for you. And the fathers will just look at the boy or the girl, daughter, and say, excuse me, we have a deal. The deal is you don't get any ice cream until you finish. I mean, you don't get any ice cream until you finish your peas, not manipulate a better deal with me. And the child will sometimes respond like, you're so mean, mommy doesn't do that to me. And dad will often respond some version of, excuse me, you can continue crying and whining, and then there'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. And so the kid eventually gets with the dad that the way to get the ice cream is to focus on finishing the peas. Now, a couple words that were important there: focus and finish, which are related to each other. The kid learns that instead of manipulating a better deal, which is successful with the mother, because the mother is sensitive to the things that can, that are working, that are not working in the day, and the stresses the child might have. And the mom is saying to herself, I am not going to make a big deal over a few peas and waste our precious moments with an argument. That is so insensitive. And the dad will say, if I give in here and let the child manipulate a better deal, the child will always be seeking he will always be developing the ability not to learn how to focus his or her attention on on what she needs to do, but will focus their attention on how to manipulate a better deal. And so when that child then that doesn't have father involvement and doesn't learn how to postpone gratification, that child misses out on the single most important thing that is needed to succeed in the world, which is the mastery of postponed gratification, because it hasn't had to focus on finishing the job that it has to do and doesn't want to do, the peas, in order to get the ice cream. And so the child goes into school, and in school, tries to get the homework done. The one that doesn't have postponed gratification gets distracted by a new text message from a friend, or a new video game that's been the friend wants to play with you, and says, well, I'll play that video game first, or I'll answer this text message first, and responds to, has no impulse control. And so that child tends to do worse in school. And then it does not get as much respect from teachers, not as much respect from friends. When it comes to boy-girl time, girls don't want to be dating losers, and so the guy starts to withdraw into porn to have access to a variety of attractive women without fear of rejection at a price he can afford, as opposed to real women. And then he starts to notice that the friends that accept him are friends who are video game players of the same video games, and he can't connect with the people at school. He starts becoming depressed and resentful. His parents aren't respecting or speaking of him as highly, and that can be a trigger to depression. In worst case scenarios, suicide. And in very worst case scenarios, there's such anger at the people at school who don't respect him or pay attention to him that it can result in school shootings.
So have you done a lot of study of the school shooters' backgrounds, their parental?
Yes. So for example, just the most powerful example is that since 1948, there has been only 28 huge school shootings. That is, with 8 or more people killed. Among those 28, 26 of them have had minimal or no father involvement.
Wow.
And that's the mass shootings, not just school shootings. That includes school shootings, but it's not mass. One of those two exceptions to the rule the recent Santa Fe killing in Texas, in which the boy did have both parents involved. But of course, there was easy access to guns, and so when the boy is depressed, that can be a very easy way of carrying out his ability to get attention from people that otherwise treated him as being invisible.
The other, and I think was the Santa Fe rejection of a girl that kind of triggered him off?
Precisely. It was I mean, we don't know every reason he did this, but very clearly a week before, a girl that he had been pursuing pretty consistently, apparently he up-leveled his pursuit of her, and she stood up in class and told the entire class what a fool he was, basically, and how she felt really bothered by him and stalked by him. And of course, that humiliated him in front of the whole class. It doesn't mean that she didn't have the reason to do that, and that was her way of speaking up. But you can imagine if he's depressed and he's feeling humiliated to begin with by the constant rejection that he received from that girl, and then she embarrasses him in front of the whole class, and he has guns available. That when you put all that together, and you have a very a Molotov cocktail type of mixture.
Did you study at all the Las Vegas shooter, because he's got the record holder right now?
Yes, he is. He killed 58, and more than about 500 were injured. And yes, I studied him quite carefully. I have a whole section in the Boy Crisis book, the background of Stephen Paddock, his father was in jail, and his father was a master at being able to figure out plots and ways of escaping from things. And he figured out how to escape from jail, but he figured out how to escape from jail within a year of when he could have gotten released.
Oh, wow.
And so apparently Stephen felt enormous feelings of abandonment, that the father could just have stuck it out for a while and then be able to come back home. But instead he had to escape and remain hidden, and couldn't return to his son and to his family. And so, one can only imagine the enormous amount of resentment which many friends and family members report that he had. But he also had a desire to prove to his father that he was worthy of his attention. And his father was a mastermind at figuring out things like how to escape and commit crimes. And so what he did was to mastermind the biggest recent shooting in U.S. history, and to show that he, in a way, I imagine, to show that he was worthy of his father's attention. And so, again, the reasons behind anything are always somewhat speculative, but the amount of evidence that I discuss in the Boy Crisis that allows you to see the connection between the handwriting on the wall and this incredibly carefully, almost genius-like prepared setup of the shooting in Las Vegas. You can easily see that connection.
Wow. Yeah, I knew that he'd been in jail, his father. It just occurred to me, I've never really paid attention to this, but are most of the school shooters Caucasian?
Almost all the school shooters are Caucasian. Black society, African-American boys have a tendency to kill each other differently. They kill other African-American boys. They do it through a combination of gangs and drugs and so on. The Caucasian outlet is much more likely to be the mass shootings, and either in schools or mass shootings in the Stephen Paddock way in Las Vegas, which you are from Las Vegas. Are you?
Yes.
Are you not?
Vegas strong.
You're extremely aware of that shooting.
All too aware of it, fortunately.
Yeah.
And I imagine the African-American kids who are killing each other, we know those are incredible high rates. It's interesting that they go to a different place than white kids do. White kids go to a school and black kids go to each other. And I know in the black community, there's sometimes a lot of fatherlessness over there on that side. And I really shouldn't say that because I don't know that for a fact. It may be that they're very similar in our thing. So I want to
No,
I'll step back from that.
your instinct that you censored is your instinct is 100% accurate.
Mm.
Here's a way of understanding this. In 1965, there was a sociologist who was also a U.S. senator and also Department of Labor secretary under both Nixon and Johnson. And he's a very brilliant man named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who did something that is commonly called the Moynihan Report.
Mm.
He looked at the African-American communities to try to find out why the crime rate was so high. And many people were really, shaking in their boots, figuring out that there was going to be some type of, racism, that there's something inherently inferior about the African-American boy or girl. And he found quite a different phenomenon, which is that what was common among the African-American community, with the African-American community, was that there were 25% of the children were being brought up without dads, as opposed to 3.2% of children in the Caucasian community being brought up without dads. And he showed the connection between the fatherlessness and the crime, and that particularly that the crime was highest among that 25% of children being brought up in without dads. Now, that's 25% lack of involvement with fathers in 1965. In the African American community today, it is 72%. And in the Caucasian community today, it is 33%. That is significantly higher than the 25% that it was in the African American community in the days that they were looking at the African American community and saying, why are there so many shootings? Why are there so many killings? Why is there so much crime? And why are there so much a problem with drugs? And we now know that the single most important connection to drugs, to taking drugs, is a lack of father involvement. And usually that means in a family of divorce, or in a family that in which the mother has a child to begin with without being married. And I say without being married, that's important. I am not a big thing. If you don't have children, you're married or not married, that's your business. But if you have children, the importance of marriage is very great, because when a couple is not married and they have children, the likelihood of the father is less being with the child for more than 3 years in any significant way it's 40% likely that the father will have minimal or no contact with the child after 3 years. So if you don't want to put your child in an enormously dangerous probability of having a lack of father involvement, marriage does help solidify the bond and take you through a better, for better or for worse. And if you are married and feel like you just cannot get along with your partner, number one is make sure you get very excellent couples communication counseling, where you're communicating with each other, so you won't have such a desire to divorce. And if you do divorce, I talk about in the Boy Crisis book, 4 must-dos. You must have an equal amount of, if you want your children to do well, you must have an equal amount of father involvement after divorce, father and mother involvement. Dad and mom must live within 20 minutes drive time from each other. There must be no bad-mouthing your child overhears about the father or the mother. And there must be consistent couples communication or relationship counseling that you do after the divorce. If you do all 4 of those things, and especially the first 3, then the chances are fairly good that you will have children do almost as well, not as well, but almost as well as they would in a family that was not experiencing divorce.
Does a lot of this come down to our? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I stopped.
Does a lot of this come down to our cavemen, hunter-gatherer roles in our basic DNA, and how important this is to teach the future generations? I mean, certainly my dad made it a point to teach me lessons. My mom, not so much. I mean, my mom taught me stuff, but when Dad really laid into you with the belt, he was teaching you a lesson because he wanted you to learn something. So He wouldn't have to teach you again. And also, I remember my dad saying, "I want to teach you something about life."
Mm-hmm. Yes. This gets back to what you were talking about before, very instinctively, and again correctly on your part. This whole enforcement. Dads sometimes went too far with enforcements. The belt, taking the belt to a child or hitting the child is a father's way of saying, I've run out of my other ways of knowing how to make sure you get this point. And in fact, there are so many other ways of helping your child get a point that one does not have to resort to that. But nevertheless, it was our Father's way of saying, this is not acceptable. But in almost every aspect of parenting. There's about 10, when you have a mother and father involved, you have with the father about 10 differences in what I call dad style versus mom style. So, for example, if your son or daughter comes home from school one day and says, I'm really upset. Mrs. Myers doesn't like me. I know she hates me. Would you get me a different teacher? Mom will her heart will tend to open and she'll say, oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. And in the back of mom's mind, she'll be going, this would be terrible that my son or daughter is going to have a bad early childhood experience with school. I don't want this to happen. I know how foundational the early years are. I will volunteer to my son or daughter to relieve that pain and stress by going in and communicating with the principal and saying my son or daughter should have a different teacher than Mrs. Myers. The father will take that same experience and say, oh, sweetie, that's terrible. That's you must be very hurt and bothered, et cetera, et cetera. And then he'll say something like, typically, in life, you have to learn to get along with people that you don't get along with at the outset. So I could talk to Mrs. Myers, but before I do, what do you think Mrs. Myers would say is upsetting her about you? And the boy or the girl would be a little bit like angry that question would be asked. And mother would often be furious that question is being asked. And so from the mother's perspective, like, you're not protecting our daughter or son. Why are you blaming the victim? What's happening here? Don't you love him or her? How can you let them have this type of experience and let them suffer this way? From the dad's experience, from the dad's way of looking at it, it's you want to make sure right now when you're young that you find out as many ways as possible to get along with people that you don't inherently or easily get along with. So what can we do to change that? The first way to do it is to walk a mile in the moccasins of the teacher and ask, in this case, what is the teacher seeing that is making her or him not like you? And so when the father finally gets some findings out of that from the daughter or the son, the father then says, well, maybe we should talk with Mrs. Myers and have a talk with both you and her. And so the mother's saying, no, this is so insensitive. You're not really protecting our son or daughter. And so when the mother and father are working together and respecting each other equally, they'll often come to some type of compromise, like saying, maybe we can go ahead and have a talk with Mrs. Myers and a talk with our son, and maybe we can bring the two of them together before we go to the principal. But if all that doesn't work and we're convinced that there's no way that our son can get along, our daughter can get along with Mrs. Myers, then we'll go ahead and talk to the principal. So a compromise is made. But if the child senses that paying attention to the father's method is going to be overruled by the mother, who will demonize the father because the father isn't protecting the child will pick that up, ignore the father, and start crying more to be able to manipulate the change of the teacher without having to learn how to get along better with that teacher.
That's very interesting. I've always been disturbed by parents that demonize the other parent. I'm not going to point. I mean, I've seen both sexes do it. And to me, I've always been disgusted by it because I remember I stood in as a pseudo stepfather. I was engaged to a gal for a while with 2 kids, and they had an alcoholic father who was largely out of control. I mean, there were sometimes he would just call and just berate the kids, or he would be really mean, and he was really taken with the what he felt was a competition. And I finally had to sit down with him and say, look, I'm not here to undercut you. You are their father. I'm not here to take that away from you. I'm not here to, try and minimize you or what you're about, because you will always be their father. I don't want to ever get in the way of that relationship or cause a crisis, because I felt like what you just said, there's a thing there. So let me ask you this. I know that, men are usually very logical. That's not always the case. Women are usually very emotional. My dad was the logical one. If you scar your knee, he'd say, suck it up and quit crying and go get a Band-Aid. And, in life, you're going to need that. And my mom, she cuddle you and hold you and comfort you. That may be why more when kids win at football, they go, thanks, Mom, or hi, Mom, on TV. And they never think Dad who taught them football. I've always thought that was a funny joke. But there are roles that I've seen in relationships where a man is the emotional, woman-like one, and the woman is more the man, logical one. And let me throw another thing into that mix. We now have like gays raising children, and sometimes they're both women, sometimes they're both men. I have no opposition to that whatsoever. How does that whole thing play into the scheme of what we're talking about?
Yes, if you do have that type of role reversal, if the woman is more the tough it out type of person, tough love parent, and the father is more sort of prone to coddling, it's a relatively unusual scenario, but that also works as long as neither one is undermining the other. So
you got the two facets of roles, and I do know a lot of gay and lesbian couples where there is usually like a lesbian, there's usually one that's very manly, very kind of fatherly, and there's the one thing I learned a long time ago, and I forget what this was, but it had to do with animate. There's something that deals with the fact that we are different. We are meant to complement each other and give rise to the since we're different, we help complete each other as a partnership. And to me, I grew up in the 70s. My mom was big into the ERA. She was in the Equal Rights Amendment, I think it was. She was big in the Equal Rights Movement. And I remember growing up on the front lines of that and thinking, what is this going to do in my world if my mom goes to work? And of course, later on in my years of teenagedom, my mom did go to work and stuff like that. So it's interesting to me how all this plays out and the importance of the family, and not just in the boy crisis. I owned a modeling agency for about 6 years, and I was around a lot of women who were very good looking. And one proponent that I saw, especially with my friends who got into stripping or escorting or other things, is they didn't have a real powerful role model father in their life. And so they were seeking attention from men. And I remember one of my friends who owned a strip club used to say, God, if it wasn't for dads not being in daughters' lives, I'd be out of business. I wouldn't have anybody to dance here.
Yes.
And so I've been on the forefront of seeing the women that are affected by not having fathers in their relationships. But the boy crisis, like what you're talking about, where we have kids shooting up stuff. I mean, certainly that seems like you need to have that anime, that completeness of whatever. And I forget the term, so forgive me.
Yes. Well, first of all, the complementary, what I call checks and balance parenting is very important. And so just let me reinforce what you're saying here about our daughters as well and lack of fathers. Here's a good example of that. In Baltimore, there was a study of women who did not have, who were teenagers when they had children and were not married. And the challenges that they went through, which were very considerable, and then they looked at all the children of those children, and they found that 30 some odd percent of those children also had teenagers, had children without being married when they were teenagers, and so but they looked at the subsection of that among those children who had a significant father involvement. Instead of it being 30 some odd percent, I think it was 33% of those children having children without being married themselves as teenagers, the percentage fell to 0. Now, if you're familiar with social science research, you look at the studies of dysfunctional behaviors in human beings, you almost never see a 0 percentage, come out. But yet here, the children, even from who were children of women who had their children without being married as teenagers, with those children had significant father involvement. There was a 0 percentage that had their children out of wedlock. Now, what happens with girls when they don't have a significant amount of father involvement is right up the alley of what you're talking about. Either on the one hand, they are sexual very quickly with men when they don't feel themselves to be ready to be sexual, because they don't want to be rejected by a man, and they don't know all the other ways of keeping a man's attention, because they don't have dads are not in their psyche in a nuanced type of way. Or alternatively, they're so afraid of intimacy that they don't have relationships or sex. They're afraid of sex and they're afraid of intimacy with men. And so they don't know how to navigate a secure, non-sexual male being. And when they have a significant amount of father involvement, and they have the roughhousing, and they have the interactiveness, and they're able to do a verbal battle and physical battle, not quote battle with their dad, their security is much greater. They're much less likely to be strippers, much less likely to be prostitutes, but much less likely to be having problems in those 2 areas that I mentioned. To say nothing of drugs and drinking and disobedience and delinquency. And now all of those. So those are some of the differentiators with girls. The drugs, the drinking, the disobedience, those are even more powerful outcomes that are negative with boys that don't have significant amounts of father involvement.
Mm-hmm. The word that I was looking for is, so scratch that anime stuff. People are like, why is he talking about cartoons? The word I'm looking for is animus.
Mm-hmm.
It's a male thing. It basically, the context to which I initially read it was about the counterpart or duplicity, about how we are opposite, but we are counterparts that complement each other, that come together. And we shouldn't be looking at what opposes us as like, you're different than I am, and resisting the polar opposites, but to reconcile those opposites to complement each other. And in a case of what we're talking about, to deliver the best resources to a child in having them go through a development process. I mean, certainly, I often wondered. I was very lucky to grow up with parents that didn't get divorced until after we left the thing. My parents were very unhappy. Let me spin this to you too. Does some of this have to do with it takes a village to raise a child? When I grew up, and probably when you grew up, if you were bad in the neighborhood, one of the neighbors would get you, probably beat you, spank you, and then take you to your parents and tell your parents what you did. And then your mom would spank you. And then, she'd be like, when your dad comes home, and you'd spend hours dreading that experience. And nowadays that doesn't happen, especially in our village. We don't have, there's not, I can go be bad in my neighborhood as a child and no one kicks my ass, partially because someone will sue them or, whatever. Is that a factor in all this?
It is a factor. There is, and if someone does report it, and there's a single mom, the single mom will often defend the child, or pick the child up from jail. The father is more likely to say, "He got in prison. Let's let him spend a day or two.
Let's spend a day or two.
Let him experience this, and this is better that he gets the experience of this. When he's younger, then he continues to feel some permission to get away with things because we'll always rescue him, and then eventually he gets in trouble for a bigger crime. And so there's a very different attitude. When dad is not around, there is a much greater propensity on the part of both girls and boys, but especially on the part of boys, to feel they can get away with things, and take those risks, and not pay attention to the types of boundaries. And and many of the parents in the village, they're afraid to say anything to the mother because, after all, she's a single mother. And if they do say something to the single mother, they're afraid that the single mother will shoot back and say, and protect the child. And so they'll just increase they'll increase the tension between the two. Whereas the ethic of the old days, as you would say, the ethic was, yes, please watch out. If my child is doing anything, let me know. I will get on his or her case so that they don't do that again. That security on the part of the outsiders to the family is not as great as it used to be by a long shot. You're absolutely right.
So let me ask you this. I mean, I think a majority of families now are separated, are single parent families, or it's getting to be that way. What can a parent do if they're in a situation? I mean, does it need to be 50% parental? What's the term in the divorce documents? Parental ownership, oversight. What's it? Custodian. I have one divorce friend right now, and he wants 50-50 share of parental oversight or a sharing of the kids, and she wants all of it, and he gets weekends or something. What's your recommendation about how to deal with it if you're a single parent listening right now and you're like, what do I do with this information?
Short of your husband or wife being abusive or driving while drunk while your child doesn't have a seatbelt in the front seat, if you're talking about child endangerment at that level, then we're talking about something. There's a different set of solutions aside from involving the other, the biological parent. But by far and away, the children that do best after divorce have about an equal amount of time with both their mother and their father. There are so many reasons for this. So I've talked about the roughhousing. I've talked about the boundary enforcement. I've talked about the postponed gratification. I've talked about the tendency of fathers to want to have the child work through an issue that is uncomfortable. There are so many. The father is also far more likely to take the child out camping and have them do adventures that the mother might be fearful of, because the father should be closer to the child and monitoring the child more closely. The father is much more likely to be okay about the child getting lost, and therefore the child learning what it needs to watch out for in order to not get lost. Whereas the mother feels that the father is neglectful or abusive in at least an indirect way if that doesn't happen. This checks and balance parenting. If the father is only with the child a small percentage of the time, let's say every other weekend and a night during the week, here's what happens. The father does not have hangout time. Hangout time is the second or third most important characteristic for a father to have with a son, and the most important characteristic for a father to have with a daughter. That is, I'll just give you an example of that. Let's say the father picks up the son from a soccer game or a daughter from a soccer game. But particularly if he picks up the son from a soccer game and something's gone wrong at the soccer game, and the dad says, how was the game today, Jimmy? And Jimmy will go, okay. And dad will sense that something is wrong, but he'll just leave it alone for a while. And he might ask, anything wrong? And Jimmy will tend to go, no, everything was fine. But if there's hangout time and they're both just going around, they're doing while dad's in the vicinity while Jimmy is doing homework later, and dad is requiring Jimmy to do his homework rather than get focused on the video games as a way of undoing his depression from what happened at soccer. It will take a while for Jimmy eventually to say, Dad, suppose you're a goalie and you think you did a really good job as a goalie, but then suddenly the coach doesn't let you be goalie the next week. What's that about? And and that's when the Jimmy will begin to reveal what is bothering him that he wouldn't reveal when picked up. Now, if the father had to take Jimmy right from the soccer game to mom's house. Would Jimmy have a chance to say this to mom? Absolutely, because he would expect mom to have completely nurturing feelings. But it takes a while for Jimmy to say that to dad, because dad will expect a different type of cross-examination with Jimmy. He'll be more likely to say, well, what happened? Tell me more details about that. What could you have done differently? What do you think you did differently? What do you think the coach's perspective on that was? And sort of, it'll be a little bit empathetic, but also more challenging. And that takes a bit more hangout time for the boy to feel comfortable sharing. But the boy knows that he wants to eventually share with the father, because what he knows he's going to get from the father is some honesty and some confrontation and some ability to therefore do better the next time. But he has to be comfortable with that before he reveals. He doesn't have to be as comfortable with that before he reveals to his mom, because he feels he's going to get more approval, protection, and maybe what's the matter with that coach response, rather than, or maybe we shouldn't have you play soccer anymore, or maybe you should go to a different team, some type of protection like that. And so that's just an example of how important the 50-50 time is, because if the daughter and the son need that extra hangout time for the daughter is what allows her to know how to interact with a male, how to get teased by the father. The moms will very rarely tease a child. Fathers will tease children, both daughters and sons, more frequently. So when a daughter is involved with a guy, and the guy is making jokes or teasing, the girl doesn't look at it as being abusive. The girl is used to it from her father and knows what teasing is about, and is able to be adjusted to teasing as a way of giving the other person a little bit of a signal as to what is wrong, without directly confronting that person, and being able to pick up the nuances of a slightly different tone of voice, or having fun poked at one, rather than having a direct criticism in a confrontive way. And so all of these things are such important differences between the mother and the father. So if you're a mother and you believe you have a motherhood instinct, and you feel the father is neglectful or almost abusive with the children, or doesn't protect them well enough, really study the 10 differences that I talk about in the Boy Crisis of what of dad's style versus mom's style. Understand the functions that your style and his style serve, so that you use your motherhood instinct to involve him more. Many times fathers will drift away and be more interested in a football game or some other woman, or some dating, or something that seems narcissistic to you, because fathers come around when they're needed. When you let the father know that you appreciate what he contributes and you need him. Remember, men who were needed were willing to go to war and die, give up their life in order to contribute to being needed to fight off the Nazi Germans and other opponents. If you let a dad know he's needed, and that you respect his style and his contribution, the chances of him coming around will be much greater. If you don't have a father that in any way possible can be involved, get your son involved with Cub Scouts. Get your son involved with Boy Scouts. They have developed a really good structure to be able to combine the best of masculinity with things like loyalty, character development, honesty, being true to your word, being prepared. Things like that are the best parts of masculinity. So if you've heard words used like toxic masculinity, and you want to avoid that with your son, get your son involved with the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts. Get your son involved with a faith-based community where he can sit around with other boys and talk about the things that are bothering him, with a good male mentor guiding him with a combination of sensitivity and confrontation. These things will be helpful if you can absolutely cannot in any way get the father involved.
What about like a grandfather? My grandfather had a larger impact on me than my father did, although my father did have an impact on me of the belt. But my grandfather's interactions with me shaped me more into manhood, although I inherited a lot of my dad's stuff because I was around him so much.
Yes. First of all, yes, a grandfather is a wonderful add-on, but never quite a substitute, because we look in the mirror and whatever our father was or wasn't, and particularly if we feel abandoned by our dad, anything that we hear that is negative about our father, when we look in the mirror, we see our eyes are similar to our father's, or my former wife, with whom I'm still very good friends. We just belong to a very similar to the same think tank together, and we met at that think tank. And she said, "My goodness, you look so much like your dad when your dad was your age now." And so it was, we look in that mirror and we see that, the same eyes, the same nose, the same body language, the same walk, and so on. And so whatever our experiences are about our father that were negative, we deal with the fact that will we be that way? If we hear our mother talk negatively about our father, we also fear that, if the mother said that your father was narcissistic, we look in the mirror, we see, gee, I'm looking in the mirror. Maybe I'm a narcissist too, just like my dad. Maybe I'm worthless. Maybe, I'm irresponsible. Maybe I'm a liar. I did lie to Joe the other day. So maybe I'm inherently that way. And so we can't talk about it with anybody, because if we talk about it with our father is furious that the mother said that. If we talk about it with our mother, the mother is feeling like that we're confronting the one source of security we have. And so we're caught between a rock and a hard place, and we become introspective. We go inward in a negative way, not an introspective way.
So do parents need to realize that their different styles of discipline and admonishment and encouragement to the child are complementary, and they shouldn't be at odds? And sometimes one is good for situations, one is good for others.
Absolutely. It is what I call checks and balance parenting. It's a lot like, if you're a Republican or a Democrat listening to this, you may hate the other, if you're a Republican, you may hate the Democrats and vice versa. But some part of you probably knows that there's a value to there's a wisdom to the checks and balances that were set up, so that, that every part of government is checking and balancing the other parts of government. And when that gets too out of balance, that's when we have the worst happening.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
And my father, I was lucky enough to grow up with a father, and I feel blessed they didn't get divorced until after we left. Although it was a tough situation for everyone, because no one was getting along. But my father taught me a lot about manhood, what it was to be a man, whether he did it by example or whether he did it in instructive lessons. His blueprint of being a man was the one I based my blueprint of being a man. I can't imagine growing up without a father figure being in my life and not having that person to reinforce that. Do you think that some of this, this one parent family, I'm not going to blame either side for this, is contributing to the millennials, the laziness, and some of the things we're seeing from the generation of the millennials and subsequent generations, where they don't want to date at an early age. They don't want driver's licenses. They don't, they're staying at home longer. Do you think that's contributing to that generation?
Absolutely. What we see is this enormous difference between the groups of millennials who have a significant amount of father involvement, and especially if that father is involved in an equal type of checks and balance way. If the father's involved, but knows that the mother rules and he has to just agree with what the mother says, not so effective. But the father that really, where the mother and father are not only talking with each other, and you said something before that let me know that you really understood this. It is the father and mother having those disagreements. If they get into an argument, believing that it's the mother's style that's best or the father's style that's best, then that's dangerous, because that can lead to a divorce. But if they get into a discussion in which they know that each of them have something to contribute, and their job is to apply that to this situation of Mrs. Myers not like, the son saying Mrs. Myers doesn't like me, of the of whether or not I can go overnight at this age with the Cub Scouts, and then there's girls now that are allowed to join the Boy Scouts, and should I be allowed to go overnight and be with in a parallel situation when the girls are also in a camp nearby? Is, and the father will be more likely to say yes. But maybe you should take a condom in case. And the mother will say, "How dare you even mention the word condom?" And don't put him in that situation. And so that's a discussion that's worth having, and it's a discussion that's not only worth having between mother and father. It's a discussion that can also take place at family dinner night. One of the things that I found coming up so frequently as a solution for problems that come up when I did the research for the boy crisis was a family dinner night. But as I ran family dinner nights by many families, I saw that for many families, they became family dinner nightmares. And so I ended up doing a whole series of guidelines as to how to construct a family dinner night so they not only did not become family dinner nightmares, but so that you introduce to your children the dilemmas that you as a parent were facing, and ask the kids to imagine what they would do if they were the parent. And when you ask the child to be a parent in their mind's eye, oftentimes their solutions are a lot like the solutions of parents, even though as a child they would argue for a different type of solution. But the fact that you're asking your child to process and think about what they would do as a parent if they were in your situation begins to get the child to know how to intuitively walk a mile in the moccasins of the parent. And that is part of what brings the family closer together.
There's some definite truth to that, because both, I believe, my mom and dad would put that on us sometimes, and we'd just be like, well, we would do, oh, yeah.
It's amazing how fast you figure out your parents are.
And then there's the old adage of when you become a parent, you're like, so this is, oh, wow, okay. Now I know what my mom meant when she said, I hope you have someone like you when you grow up, because you're going to find out.
Yeah.
Recently with school shootings, we've this new term that I became aware of after this most recent school shooting was this incels thing. And incels are members of an online subculture, predominantly male, I'm sure, who define themselves as being unable to find romantic or sexual partners. And they've come together as a group online to rail against women and what they feel is being rejected or manipulated or done by women. And they're actually celebrating, which is weird, their celibacy, their involuntarily celibacy, because they can't get along with women. Is that what's causing this incel sort of incident? These men who can't figure out how to be men and how to date women and how to interact with them?
Yes, very much. I mean,
Wow.
It's important to understand that the word incel means involuntarily celibate.
Yeah.
It's not like they want to be celibate. There's a really relatively small percentage of men that want to be celibate. It's usually feeling like, that there's the challenges of fulfilling oneself sexually are so complex, and the knowing how to deal with a woman who is usually more emotionally nuanced and asks of us things that the man that does not grow up knowing how to interact in that type of nuanced type of way is fearful. And then he looks around and he sees that, if he's expected to take the sexual initiatives, but if he does it too quickly or too soon, or doesn't get, now in California and in 26 other states, if you are on a college campus and you ask a woman if she wants to go out with you, and she says sure, and you reach over to hold her hand, and you don't ask her first if you can hold her hand, she can legally sue you for sexual harassment.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you ask her, and the expectation is, and most of the rules are set up differently in different states, but in California and in many states on the college campus, if you do this, if you reach out and hold her hand without asking her, and she responds and positively, and then you go ahead and you reach over to kiss her without getting her verbal permission, you can then you can be sued for sexual harassment for violating, not asking her at each stage of progressive intimacy. So a number of things come up. If there's a later he said, she said incident, and you say that you asked her first, and she said that you didn't, that she is going to, and you don't have it in writing, then you can be sued legitimately for sexual harassment. Now, this is amazing because we are not training our daughters to share the responsibility of the risks of sexual rejection. We're training our sons to be expected to do the risks of sexual rejection, and training our daughters to have the option to do that. And so we're not preparing our daughters to be good risk takers, and we are preparing our daughters to be to have the freedom to be able to sue someone who she drinks with at a party at night, and they both get drunk, but they're not unconscious, and they both have consensual sex within the framework of being drunk. And the following morning, the girl remembers that, oh my God, I have a boyfriend. I didn't even call him. He's furious at me that I didn't call. And he's worried because I went to this party. And in fact, I did have sex with this boy, and I really shouldn't have. I was drinking. I was probably drunk. I can then say to my boyfriend, it was rape. And the boyfriend will say, well, you've got to report that. And before you know it, that girl is reporting that boy with whom she had consensual sex. Right? Now, obviously, and so what we're doing is we're saying if a boy gets drunk, he's responsible for his behavior. But if a girl gets drunk, she is according to the law, this affirmative consent law that exists in 26 states. She is not responsible for her behavior if she gets drunk, and therefore, even if she tells the investigators that she had consensual sex after the fact, her initial complaint that it wasn't consensual is what must be believed. And this was the law of the Obama administration that Betsy Voss is trying to turn around now. But at the same time, this is still the law in many states, and it is making so many of these boys who are called incels so scared of what could happen to them if they take an advance that is inappropriate or considered inappropriate later. If they don't get drunk, they're afraid that they will not be accepted and responded to. If they do get drunk, they could be the only sex that's responsible. And all of this is an enormous insult to girls. We say respect women and respect girls' sexuality. But if we don't ask girls to take responsibility, and we do ask boys to take responsibility, that should be a disrespect for our daughters.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be a balance of that. I remember seeing, the Me Too movement has been very prevalent. I'm very supportive of it in areas where it's incredibly accurate and true. I've seen some bad actors that have hijacked the Me Too movement in a FOMO sort of desire where their cases haven't been the same. One of the extremes, and kind of in the same context we're talking about in dating and hand-holding and everything else, was the seize and sorry thing, where someone tried to turn that into a Me Too thing, and it just was really a bad date. And the girl had a responsibility. From everything I heard her say, she had a responsibility to say, no, I'm not going to your home, and no, I'm not doing this. But and there's a certain play, and I think there was probably alcohol, and everyone gets a little booze going and whatever. And it was a bad date. But instead of taking responsibility for that, she tried to turn that into a FOMO thing, and to join the Me Too movement. I grew up being taught to be a man that you have to make the first move. You have to be the man. That's what everyone says. Certainly I was on dates with women when I made that theater move where you put your arm around her, or, you grab her hand. But, I was on a date. I wasn't, what's his face? The movie star, Harvey Weinstein. I wasn't doing that on the job. I was actually on a date when I was putting those moves on someone. And so there was an acceptance of, well, we're on a date. So, we'll see how this happens. Certainly, if a girl didn't like me, then she'd withdraw her hand or whatever, or pull away. And that was fine. But yeah, I'm interested. I'm kind of curious with those incels and the shootings of schools and the male. A lot of males now are feeling lost. I mean, some of the Trump voters were white males who feel like they're becoming outnumbered, like they're losing power, if you will, from their white power. There's some of that that's going on. I've joked for 20 years that the biggest, the one group of people in society that don't complain and that probably feel most discriminated now are white males, because everybody else seems to be on their soapbox, and really so in a lot of cases. Their soapbox is feeling discriminated, and we always seem to be the punching bag of like it's always our fault. And I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying it is. But I'm just saying there's kind of that. I'm interested in how all this meshes together and what the future holds, and where as we go through these, ups and starts, and certainly women need to be respected, and certainly women, need to be given power, but everyone needs to have responsibility to themselves and be self-actualized. Where if they do something, then they should be responsible for doing it, or if they put themselves into situations, they should be responsible and take some blame.
Yes. Hashtag Me Too needs to be much, it's like you, I'm just, my mind is blown at some of the behaviors of some of the men. And
yeah, that was the hardest thing I had with the Me Too movement, because I don't operate from some of the really awful things, and I don't think from some of those things. I've had friends that have sent dick pics. I've had friends that have been jerks to women, and usually I've had something to say to them privately at like, you need to knock that off, and I doubt they did. And the hardest for me, being a man, I've always tried to be a good moral man. I'm not sure I've always been perfect, but I've always tried to be, I'm not out raping people and putting, Bill Cosby sort of stuff. And, it was hard to put my head around that there are a lot of guys who are behaving very badly.
Yes.
And, I was just kind of, well, this is how I deal with women, and I try to be respectful with them in most of my business dealings. It was just wild to see how far some guys were really taking it. Okay. And how they were abusing power and doing stuff, and what was going on. But so I think there's definitely a lot of correction that's going to go on. I don't think the Me Too movement is going to be a negative thing for our society, but it is going to be interesting how, I actually declared on Facebook, because a few of my friends were blamed for being. A few of my friends were blamed in the Me Too movement because they were too handsy or too friendly or too huggy. And, I was like, I really took a step back, and I said, if you see me at an event, we've had girls come up to us and they plop down on our laps and they hug us and give us a smooch on the cheek and be overly friendly and be sometimes flaunting like, hey, there's stuff over here for the taking. And then later that turned into a Me Too sort of thing that implicated some of my friends. And so I was like, I'm not hugging anybody anymore, and I'm not going to even shake your hand, whether you're a man or woman. I'm just not going to be called that I I gave you a hug and grabbed your butt. So it's interesting to me, especially with this incels sort of group of people, this mentality, which I'm sure will expand now that it's been kind of brought up to the forefront of news, and maybe we'll have more boys. So let me ask you this. Let me let you expand on that if you want to contribute anything to that first.
Yeah, I very much agree with you. I think, there's almost every man I know is, been shocked by some of the negative behaviors of males, and I think that it's important for women to speak up about that. And I'm very glad hashtag Me Too has articulated that. But it's only the first step of multiple steps. First of all, the hashtag Me Too does articulate the experiences of women for whom men have gone too far. But it doesn't articulate the experiences of many more conservative women. I remember when I was in college, and I was at the end of a date, and I said to a woman I was with, we were in a car, I said, would you like to do some parking now? And she goes, Warren, you don't ask me whether I want to park, you park. And it was sort of like, don't, and then you just kiss me, and don't put me in the position of having to say, I want to kiss you, or I want to park, or, I don't get turned on by a guy that's asking for permission. And so there's that aspect of things as well. And then there's the next aspect, which is, if you don't want to do something, and you're, let's say, at the workplace scenario where it's most inappropriate, and the guy says something like, "You really look nice today," or puts his hand on your shoulder, or a little bit even lower than that, which most of us know is inappropriate. But on the other hand, if you're if you feel it's inappropriate, whatever is happening, whether it was the hug, whether it was your boss rubbing your shoulders and so on, your first requirement is to say to your boss, "This does not make me feel comfortable," and then please do not do that again. And so before you speak to an HR person about it, and that is, and then if it's ignored a couple, and you say it a second time and it's ignored again, now it's time to go to an HR person and to talk about it. And then it's important for the HR person to talk with the man about what's his perspective on that, not just to be filing a harassment complaint. HR has become, from the perspective of many men, it's no longer HR, where H stands for human, but it's HER. It's taking her perspectives on things, or it's trying to defend the company against being in a lawsuit. So women have one experience of HR, which is that the company is the person at the head of HR is afraid to make it into a lawsuit that will hurt the company and hurt the company's reputation and hurt the company monetarily. On the other hand, the man whose perspective on that interaction and what led him to that is never even given an airing, and he's often accused without it being sort of a complex dialogue. One of the things that I've learned in dealing with, I do couples communication workshops all around the country, and I have something that is so powerful for me, which is that I have a 4-part picture of Mario Cuomo, the former governor of New York. And it's done by 4 different artists of Mario Cuomo at the exact same second in time. And, and they're 4 extremely different pictures. And the pictures represent what every couple experiences, that when one person shares a perspective on the world, part of what my job is to get each person in the partnership to hear completely 100% the other person's, their partner's perspective on something, but then to sit back and begin to hear the perspective of the person who just heard you. And but before I have them do that, I show this picture of the 4 different pictures of one person in one point in time, and say, do not expect your partner, who has just heard your perspective by your evaluation with 100% perfection, do not expect that understanding of your perspective to also be agreement with your perspective. Your partner will have a different picture of that exact same situation, if he or she feels enough courage to bring up their true feelings. And so our job is to go beyond #MeToo, but to have #both of us, both men and women, both employer and employee, both Republican and Democrat. We all have to have a say that is equally respected. And when that say is equally respected, there'll be many fewer incels, because men will feel that they have a chance to speak with women and be heard, not just choose between 100% agreement and 100% being called a sexist or a racist.
And I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure if what you're referring, but I would, my opinion would be that that's not what's creating the incels. I mean, I would say more the fatherless thing. One thing I felt kind of crippled in dealing with women in my life, because my sister was born about 7 years younger than us. And so there was And there was me and my brother who were born within a year or so. My sister was born with like 7 years later than I think my younger brother. And we were very distant in our relationships with her, partially because my mother declared her as, the princess, and she was actually given a lot of privilege over us. I mean, we actually did chores and she did nothing. There was some real dynamics there that we didn't like. But I really didn't understand women. And I wish now, as a child, I'd had either more interaction or more sisters or more understanding of women, because it took me much more years to really understand women, what they were about. For a long time, I was deluded that there was a woman out there who was a certain way that I wanted, and there just wasn't. I mean, women are, and until I kind of got involved with semi-raising of children, that I realized that how different we are, especially from birth, in how we operate, our emotional and intellectual statuses, and what we do. So it's going to be interesting to how all this plays out. I think the Me Too movement is a great way for us to have this discussion and talk about stuff and to expose a lot of this stuff. There is a lot of sex abuse that's hidden. There's a lot of sexual abuse when it comes to job and work, and somehow we have to balance this thing in our society. I'm a big person who believes in the territorial flag of human. You can read everything I believe in it in the John Lennon song Imagine, and to me, whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're Chinese, or whatever you want to take and call it, we're all human. We all bleed the same. And so when I look at other cultures, especially when I experience them in food, which is my favorite way to experience other cultures, is realizing just the complement that we have. And of course, we live in a world now where there are political forces that are trying to nationalize us and, make certain other countries or colors of people, or people that have different sort of, religious beliefs, whether it's Islam or some of the sort of other religion, that those people are bad and they're different. And the biggest challenge I think we have in our society is seeing, like what we talked about, the counterparts, how they complement each other. Is there any way, because I've seen some mothers online, and I'm not going to just pick on moms, I'm going to pick on dads too, because I've seen single dads say the same thing, that I can replace that other person in life. And, I've seen single moms that take their kids fishing, and like, I'm doing what the dad would do, so therefore I'm filling his roles and there's nothing missing here. Is that really possible?
No, I mean, it certainly is possible to give your son or your daughter a lot of the experiences that the other sex brings. But ultimately, your son and your daughter are half the other parent. And when that other parent is missing, particularly if it's not like if you get a divorce, if there's a very minimal amount of father involvement, which is normally the way it goes. If there's one parent that's minimally involved, it's usually the father, and that child feels like the boy especially feels like he's left with no role model. Your daughter, at least if it's a single mom or a primary mom parenting, your daughter at least has a role model. Your son does not have a role model. And so if I were to give you, in the boy crisis, I look at 70 different challenges, problems, really ultimately, aggregately, a disaster that is likely to occur when your children don't have the other parent also involved. There's a lot that can be done to minimize that damage, but when in the final analysis, your son and your daughter look in the mirror and they see the other biological parent reflected in the mirror. And if they feel that other biological parent has abandoned them, it hurts a great deal. And if they feel that the other biological parent has not abandoned them, but for some reason can't be with them, they still feel like they're a duck raised by a chicken, and that the other parent is something that's their genes too, but they don't know much about who that other half of them is. And so that's part of the damage. And I need to end because I have another interview coming up. But if I were to give you one just piece of science to hold on to, it is that by the age of 9, children who have a minimal amount of father involvement, on average, their telomeres are 14% shorter. The telomeres are the part of your cell that when your cell reproduces, which it constantly does, if your telomeres are shorter, there are some genes that do not get reproduced, the genes to prevent cancer, the genes to prevent heart disease, the genes to prevent one thing or the other that do not get reproduced. To such the telomeres are such an indicator of your future health that if you're age 9 and your telomeres are 14% shorter, that means you have a prediction. The National Academy for Sciences says they predict that you'll have about a 14% shorter life expectancy. So children by the age of 9 already have 14% shorter telomeres, but the boys' telomeres are 40% shorter than the girls comparatively. So it gives you some sense of the amount of damage that is done to even the life expectancy, and to say nothing of the psychological problems that result when we don't have both parents involved, but particularly because of what fathers require of their children when fathers are allowed to be fathers. Children grow so much more productively, with so much more sense of purpose and pride and accomplishment than they do when they don't have father involvement.
Cool. Well, I'm going to let you go then. I could probably talk to you for now out of this. I'd love to have you on for part 2 discussion if there is a girl crisis as well in single parent homes. So I'd love to have you on again, but thank you for coming on. Give me your plugs once again, Dr. Farrell.
Yes, I'm the author of a book called The Boy Crisis. The co-author is John Gray, and the least expensive way to get it is at Amazon, or just order it from your local family bookstore. And it's for guys, more books sell for guys in an audiobook form, and so it is available in audiobook form, both Audible and ebook and so on. So if you prefer to stick it in the car and listen on the way to work, that's a way that you can do it as well.
Definitely. Thanks for tuning in. Everyone check out his book. And my message would be, because I've seen this from both sides of the aisle, whether you're a father or a mother, be involved in your child's life, even if you're divorced, whatever. You're the most important person who can be in their lives, both people. And like I say, I think a good compliment. Thanks to Dr. Farrell for coming by. Be sure to check out his stuff. Thanks to my audience for tuning in and staying with us. I hope to have Dr. Farrell on again, because I got a lot more questions for him. And be sure to go to iTunes, Google Play to subscribe to the show. Go to youtube.com/Chris Voss. Hit that bell notification button. We certainly appreciate you guys tuning in. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.